Welcome back to another Whiskey Wednesday with Binny's Beverage Depot. I am Pat with Brett from the Whiskey Hotline, of course. Our guest this week is Adam Spiegel from the Sonoma Distilling Company. Did I say that right?
Yes.
I probably messed it up a bit. Okay.
No, you did great.
Adam is the founder and distiller there, making whiskey in Northern California. Not the first place you think of when you make whiskey. So if anybody has any questions, just use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom. We'll get them answered for you. So Adam, how did you get to this point? Were you making whiskey before? Was this a change in careers for you? Were you just some other tech guy in California who wants a piece of the whiskey game?
You know, tech guys that don't like to wear fancy, ties and just want to show up in their slippers. No, so I was a follower of the financial crisis, like Elon Musk. If I had his money, that's totally fine, right? Right. Or his capacity to sell out tequila. So I was a follower of the financial crisis. I lost my job with a lot of other people in the U.S. and that was 2008. And I was a financial sales guy, right? So I was just picking up phones and cold calling folks. And I found myself without a job and didn't really feel like I had any sort of real tangible skills to speak of. That was one thing that really sort of irked me, is that, like, the zombie apocalypse was hitting and I had no ability to like pivot to something else because I didn't know how to do anything else. So I started making beer because we're all sad and depressed and making beer. And then beer turned into wine and wine turned into grappa. Because of course, once you're done, you have pomace and you throw it out or you use it, right? So we made grappa in a garage up in Santa Rosa, and that grappa eventually became a whiskey. We started making whiskey out of our old beer and working with mash bills using, sort of a standard brew kettle system. And then that was 2008 and 2009. And by about 2010, I realized that the stuff I was making was actually pretty good. And myself and my old business partner were sort of like, yeah, this is pretty good. Let's go live. And that we had no idea what that meant, right? There was not a lot of distilleries in California in 2010. Obviously there was the big ones that we all think about. We think about the St. George's and Charbets and Anchor and all those folks.
And that's very much that's actually very much a home brewer path. I mean, that's you got to go back 30 years, but that's like the home brewer path in the late 90s, or late 80s, early 90s. It's like a bunch of buddies in their garage making beer. It's like, hey, your beer's pretty good. You should open a brewery.
You should sell this.
Yes, right. And then all of a sudden, by 1993, everybody with a garage and a carboy had beer.
Yeah, or could come up with a really like cool name for it, or a riff on a song that only them and their friends recognize.
Right, but it seems to be harder though to do that. Like it was pretty easy for a lot of places to get ramped up. I think people don't quite understand, how there's a lot more stuff involved in doing that approach with distilled spirits.
Yeah, and there was also no real roadmap either, right? There wasn't like a playbook that we all knew we could follow and go. So, we were the 15th full-fledged distillery in California back in 2010. Now there's 150 and growing, right? And then we're within the first 200 United States, and now there's close to 2,000, right? So if you sort of look at the 2010 class, it's like people like myself and Few, and I think like the folks over there at Koval were 2 or 3 years before us. But yeah, I called up Gable Lorenzo, Ralph Lorenzo's son over at Hudson, and I was like, how do I start a distillery, right? And this guy picked up his phone, and he was so gracious with his time. He spent 2 or 3 hours with me on the phone, and we just talked. And I've tried to pass on that same generosity to other people. So since I started up in my area, there's been a ton of distilleries opening in Sonoma County. And so I've tried to spend time with all these people who call me up with their crazy ideas, just like my crazy idea. And it's been really great. And so that's kind of how we got started. And we've been rolling, and we're whiskey only, right? So unlike a lot of people who focus on gins and vodkas and rums, we've only made one thing here from day one. And I feel like that's sort of making us a bit better at what we do, just because we're sort of keeping our heads down and just focusing on the brown stuff.
Well, it's also the ability, and people also don't, having gone, in Chicago when we saw, of course, North Shore is our grand dame and really the first people that came, but they intentionally were doing just vodka and gin right out of the gates. And then, few came after that, and a couple of Koval would have drifted in somewhere after that. But that's also the fact that you started with whiskey, really commercially at least,
Especially back
started
then.
with
I mean, it was,
whiskey back
it was
then.
everybody's
'cause
MO,
nobody
like, oh,
was-
vodka
yeah.
and gin until the brown stuff ages. And that was
Yeah.
every distillery Brett and I were talking to in 2009 and 2010 was saying the same spiel, you know?
Yeah. And think
And
about
it's like-
2010 as well, like what was going on at that time, like what was, you know, there was High West was sort of paving his way on rye whiskey, right? So people were sort of thinking about like the rye renaissance, and them and Whistle Pigs and a bunch of folks were messing around with rye. So we started making our rye first. Our rye was actually the first thing I did. So from 2008, 2009, I was burning the crap out of mashes just because, you know, rye whiskey is a tough grain to work with. So not only did we start with whiskey, but we started with some of the hardest whiskey to make too. So being real gluttons for punishment there.
Well, you did Winded Wheat because you guys did a bunch of, and I've got somewhere in here, I've got some of the old label, but you guys did a bunch of stuff with wheat. I mean, you really did, for people to understand, you did some really cool things. And some of them, I mean, and some of them were like great. Some of them probably were, if you were in a different financial position, might not have hit the streets, right? And
Perhaps,
then but then you get to the point in time, it's like, okay, now we've got this down. So what were some of the things you did earlier out there that were really, because you've done a few things out of the box?
Yeah. So when we first started, we were called 1512 Spirits. It was my business partner's old barbershop in San Francisco. We built up this whole mystique around that. And I was really actually content to just sort of be like Tapestry. Like no one knew I existed. I was just the guy behind, you know, running the still 3-4 days a week and self-distributing and all sorts of crap. And then, you know, we started off releasing, so our first product out of the gate was actually a clear whiskey. We called 1512 Barbershop Rye. And I really thought that was fun. And I know people sort of, shudder, especially people on the sales side, like to think about a clear whiskey is not something that you ever want to, like, you know, make your bread on. But, you know, you can cut a still differently for a clear whiskey than you do an aged whiskey, right? So you might go a little higher up, get less of the fossil fuels and the tails, and sort of focus on more of the heart, right? You can do that. You can use different stills. We used a Georgia Ridge style still to make just that product in particular. That was a little different than all the other, you know, direct fired Alembics that we were using before. And I miss that product. I love that product. I think some of the bigger guys, I'm not going to mention their names, but they may or may not have buffaloes involved, release some clear stuff that just sort of decimated the market, right? People are like, nope, I'm good. Try to clear stuff. Don't want it ever again. I hope one day that sort of kind of comes back. So that was fun. That was different.
Well, here for that particular person represented by a large endangered species, it actually releases all of their mash bills as White Dog.
There you go.
You know what it does? Here's the thing, but their perspective is here's what this is unfortunately what the fall off was, is unless you could get into a bartender's hands or somebody do cocktails, what our experience on the retail side, talking to consumers who were trying, and we had a number of consumers that wanted to try all this, were that you either had they thought they were getting vodka, and they had vodka that tasted like something, which immediately meant
flavor.
they ran screaming, right? Vodka with flavor, so they ran screaming. And then all the other people who kind of were buying clear spirit, who realized that, you know, you guys were unique because you made a clear spirit that was a clear whiskey, but designed to be drunk.
Yeah, meant to be
Clear.
drank.
Whereas everybody else, when Heaven Hill did their series of all their mash bills, Buffalo Trace to this day, and we sell a ton of the Buffalo Trace BT1 or BT2 White Dog, but that's not designed necessarily to be a clear spirit. People wanted it, so they bottle it. But that what you want to drink off the still, the portion of the cut, isn't what it all tastes like when you get it all together to put it in wood.
Yeah.
I think people don't understand that.
Yeah, and it's really interesting you say it like that too, because so back in 2013, 3 years into our business, I actually bought my old business partner out. We rebranded the company up, and as you said, you sell the old label, the new ones. And in 2013, I started working with Hubert Germain Rabon, and the way that Hubert and I would talk about brandy and the way you cut stills with brandy is also different than the way you cut stills for whiskey, and the way you're trying
100%.
to get certain parts of the seconds and sort of focusing on this really sort of sweet spot that sort of lives between like the heart and the tail. That's sort of like a mutually acceptable place to cut a still. And you go there on purpose because you want the barrel to do a really good job of filtering out and adding tannins and sort of making that thing nice and round. And so that's something that sometimes if you don't know to do it, it's sort of just like, it seems like crazy sauce. But like, you know, you talk to a guy like Hubert who comes, you know, he's a third, fourth, or fifth generation cognac guy. That's all they do. They talk about, you know, intention, cuts, flavor, you know, what's the barrel going to do versus what can go into a bottle neat or with, you know, without any barrel aging. So those are sort of things that you have to think about. And I was super stoked to just like be humble and just be like, teach me, you know, I'm pressing the record button and just go.
Well, yeah, and you have one of the best. That's actually an interest that is actually Osakalis Distillery behind me.
Oh,
so
cool. Yeah,
filling
very
barrel
cool.
with Dan, who was also a person who worked a lot with Hubert. And
Dan is very cool. I like Dan Barber a lot. I talked to him quite a bit. He and I have been working a little bit on some of these DTC initiatives, both in the state as well as, so he is a good man. But yeah, I mean, he's, so again, another one of those sort of like classic California guys who just like paved the way for all of us. And I'm lucky that I have those people, you know, as people I can look up to, because, you know, I was able to get rolling because there was a market that they created.
So
very much.
I mean, you had the white whiskey early on, and then obviously, like you said, it's been all whiskey, and now it's more like it's pivoted. We get a lot of bourbon and rye, both regular and cherrywood. Has those kind of four marks become the main focus of the business now?
Yeah, so we've sort of settled on four products. Just to speak generally about them, you've got a rye whiskey and a smoked rye whiskey and a bourbon and a smoked bourbon. Now, they're all different mash bills and they're all made in different ways, but generally speaking, they're all meant to be sort of different. They can all stand on their own, you know, 2 feet. And then we do have products that we release that come out a little bit more rarely, right? So we've got wheat whiskeys, which we still release, that lives in used cooperage versus new. For a long time, that was called Second Chance Wheat. Now we just call it wheat.
Yeah, that's what we have, an old bottle of floating around in our office somewhere.
Yeah,
and you've got some new ones coming.
Yeah, so we got some new ones.
When are those coming?
So we are currently in the process of, everything you see now is what you're going to see the rest of this year. We are going to be going through a little bit of, we actually got a new bottle made for next year. So I'm super stoked. I'm going to have like my own, rather than using like a stock bottle that like a million other people are using, I'm going to have one of my own. So that's going live next year. But then I'm also going to start releasing some products that I've been sort of working on. So like I've got a single malt that's, you know, 4 or 5 years old now.
Oh, cool.
I'm super stoked to finally be able to release that. It's just something I've taken a little extra time in figuring out. Got some other test product stuff that, you know, it's not really worth talking about yet, but let's just say that they all work within the whiskey space or a little bit of the brandy space too. I mean, you know, Sonoma County, most people don't know, they're known for wine, but they were also known for apples before they were known for anything else. So we've got a lot of stuff that we're still working on that we're still letting sort of do its thing.
Cool. What kind of cooperage did you age the malt in?
So used cooperage. So I
Nice.
sort of subscribe to the Scottish mentality. I'm glad to hear that. Me too.
So do we.
I don't love, and I'm not speaking ill of anybody who goes into new American, because that's sort of what the Americans do, right? It's just like cut down a tree, put stuff in it. But like, if you think about the juice, the whiskey that was previously in a barrel before, it does a really good job sort of priming that barrel for the next thing that goes in it. So,
right.
You know, either my old used bourbon barrels, or I was actually buying some old Fitzgerald and Elijah Craig and some really nice old barrels. You know, I was able to get good old wood that I could then put, you know, a fresh make single malt into.
Yeah,
so
malt whiskey does not like wood. I mean, malt whiskey doesn't like new wood. Malt whiskey doesn't like new wood.
It also allows for sort of the expressiveness of like the area, the Provence where things are made, and let that stuff sort of shine. So ours is going to have sort of this coastal Scotchy thing because we're so close to the coast.
Nice.
So it's going to have this really beautiful sort of salient saltiness to it, and sort of like a Talisker, or more of a coastal Scotch. It's not when it's ready. I promise you guys will drink it first, because I'm interested to get your take on it.
Cool.
Right.
So, I mean, I guess let's kind of talk about the bourbon first.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. You want to break down the mash bill you're using on this?
Sure. So, sort of a traditional style bourbon. This is a wheated bourbon, right? So most people, of course, think about wheaters as we think about, Maker's Mark and Larceny and, Weller Antique, or Weller, right? Or Pappy, depending what year you buy it at, or how much you pay for it. So we, I like wheated bourbons. I've always enjoyed them. My grandmother used to drink a wheated bourbon, so I was sort of used to that sort of profile. And I wanted to make something that had this really sort of pronounced, like super leathery, caramel driven, sort of classic, I don't know, like someone described it as sort of like the back seat of an 84 Volvo, like something that has that really nice sort of like leather meets like cloth seat thing going on.
Yeah, only in Northern California would it be an 84 Volvo.
Yes, I am showing my region when I say that. Yeah,
There
so
did
70%.
Well, you have feel because there's the thing about wheat, and it's what contributes, because we have this sort of debate and discussion all the time with people about what wheat actually does, and how much actual forward flavor do you think that wheat actually imparts versus wheat to a certain extent allowing the corn to shine and adding some feel and some structure and some texture rather than being like overtly wheat flavored. Because if you have plain wheat distillate, it could be pretty delicate and light, right? But it has structure.
And I've had that, and you've had mine too, right? If you're talking about my wheat whiskey, that's wheat bread. That's a fresh baked bread, and that's yeasty and doughy and all those things that you think about when you actually taste like what real wheat tastes like. And that's also why I get a lot of respect when you talk to like Canadian distillers, for example, too, because when they make these things that are like 100% wheat, 100% rye, 100% corn, they understand what grain tastes like. You got to respect, and then they blend it later on and make it all sorts of fun. And so I've talked to Don Livermore about that. I'm like, this guy is definitely ahead of his time. But I think wheat is sort of like the booster button in like Sega Genesis. It just makes all the things around it better. It really does bring up, to your point, it brings out a lot more of that sort of beautiful sort of grassy corniness. It also accentuates a lot of the vanillins and caramels you get from the barrel, so it sort of lets that barrel sort of pull all that stuff out and bring it to the forward. And it's just an easy drinking product. I mean, this is at 46%, 92 proof, so we left it at a
beautiful bourbon
proof.
This is really just soft and easy, and got that caramelized fruit note on the palate. I think on the nose it smells young, but it doesn't taste young. I mean, it's rich and full.
And a little bit back to what you talked about terroir a little bit, and I just wanted to read, because you guys are very open and post a lot of information on your labels, which is fantastic.
Thanks.
And then you list your mash bill, which is the 70% corn, 25% wheat, 5% malted barley. But it's also interesting to note that you're getting corn from California as well as some from the Midwest, and wheat from California as well. Now the barley, of course, is somewhere in the upper Midwest or near West, because there's really not a great place to grow barley in California, I would guess.
You'd be surprised. So
Oregon,
a couple things. So we are blessed for a couple reasons. So the reason we still say Canada, or we still say Midwest, or we still say anywhere else that's not California, is we only moved to 100% California grains within the last, I'd say, year and a half, 2 years. Before that, we used to source grains from all over the place because we couldn't find local grain. We also happen to open up a malt house in the back of the building, so we're actually malting some grains now on site as well. So it's not 100% of the stuff that we're using, but we have a malt house here, which literally takes like a freshly malted barley, which is grown in California. So we do actually have barley that's grown here. We've got some respectable guys.
Where in California?
So they're growing it. So they grow it all over the place. In particular, it seems a lot of it's coming from near like the Dixon, Sacramento area, which is where we get all of our other grains too. So there's a lot of grains up from that come near there. But every once in a while, like I have a guy who's growing barley in Petaluma. So I know I'm going to have a 15-mile single malt in 5 or 6 years from now that's going to blow your socks off, because this is the same guy who also takes my old spent grain. So after I'm done distilling on the grain, we de-water the grains up, and the old spent grains get fed to his cows. His cows go out into the field and take shits all over the field, and then that becometh more grain for us to make into whiskey. So this really beautiful little circle of life thing is going on here in Sonoma County, and so some of our barley is being grown 50 miles away.
That's awesome. Now,
so
okay, you're malting there. I mean, is this like you're not floor malting, are you? I mean, this is
No, it's more of a more modern style approach to malting. There are big, huge sort of steeping vessels that then also have that go into kilns. Not all of it happens here. We're also working with some folks over in Alameda as well. They have a malt house out there, which is actually much larger. We actually need more malt than we could make here at our little tiny sort of test pilot malt house. So we're stoked. We have 2 sources of California ingredients. And we talked about Cherrywood before too, but we're also smoking our own grains on site too. So we smoke our own grains using California Cherrywood on 2 of those 4 products. So it's just stuff we get a chance to affect flavor from the epicenter and just make better whiskey.
That's cool. I
So
mean,
how
you're
long-
malting
how-
100% more barley than 99% of the other distilleries. So it's pretty
Right.
cool.
Yeah.
How much? So how long? So what is your timeline for you to get finally to work through stocks to get to the point in time where you're really hitting that 100% California?
Well, so we're aging stuff now a minimum of 2 years, but realistically, I'm not blending stuff until it's closer to 3 now.
Right.
So our age statement on our bottles say minimum 2, but so we're at least 3
Sure.
years from a year and a half ago.
Okay.
But the problem is I'm still grabbing stock that's also 4 or 5 years old. So it's because I'm marrying those things together. There's always sort of that DNA of some older stuff in there that's always going to have. And then I'm rolling forward some batches too. So like I'll do a blend and then I'll peel off 25% of that blend and sort of roll it to the next batch. So that's part of what I use as a marrying agent to make the whole thing taste more synchronized and sort of, and that's again, something I learned from Hubert. It's something I learned from, I did a little work with Nancy Fraley as well, the master, the nose. As
Love
they call
Nancy.
her.
We
She's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I worked with her too. She's another Bay Area person. She lives just in the East Bay. So she comes over here and yells at me and throws stuff at me. So
yes, we've talked to we've had the good fortune to talk to Nancy on a couple of her projects.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah,
She's great. There are not too many people like her in this world. So growing grains here, malting grains, smoking grains. So a lot of stuff's all happening. So now we're 100% California in terms of our sourcing, which again means I'm literally handing money to farmers versus corporations, right? Non-GMO, organic ingredients. We're also, our green thumb, it's a big part of who we are. We're Californians, we're a bunch of hippies anyway, but think about we're a wind powered facility. So all of our energy is sourced from wind. We have little wind turbines in the back of our bottles. And, we source the right ingredients. We donate them to a local farmer. He's growing grains. So, cut down our carbon footprint. These are all things that we care about.
Nice. That's really
so
cool.
And are you able to run on the energy just for it happens a lot, which is incredible in California, but you're able to run and sort of put back on the grid as a net?
So here's how it works. It's a company we talk a lot about. It's called Arcata. And what they do is they essentially take our energy bill and they just offset our usage. So they're just dumping more energy back into the grid to offset whatever usage we have. So it's not like we have wind turbines in the back that are killing birds or anything. We are working with these folks, but it's great for us as an offset because we are having an impact. So it works out super well. We send them our bill and they just charge us extra.
No, that's it. People think that it seems so daunting, and it's nice for people to understand it's not so daunting at all to be able to do something like that, right?
And it's about all of us doing it, right? So you can do this residentially, you can do it commercially, and the next thing you got 100 people or 1,000 people or 10,000 people doing it. You're buying windmills in different places all over the state, and it has a huge impact. It really does.
That's cool. Hey, I want to ask another question about the malting. You held up that Cherrywood before. That's a pretty gnarly looking piece of wood. Now, when you smoke over that, are you using pieces that size? Like, what's the process for you smoking a malt on a small scale?
So what we do is we usually cut them up into tiny little pieces. And the reason is we actually use sort of like an old school, 50-gallon drum smoker that we feed little pieces of Cherrywood into it. And then we cold smoke. So our goal is when we burn, when we cook the grains, when we smoke the grains, we're not trying to cook them. We're not trying to burn them. So you'll notice, I can try and hold it up there, but you can see these grains are fairly intact. There's no Maillard reaction burn that occurs there. And so our goal is just to get that Cherrywood smoke flavor into the grain. So when we incorporate into 2 of these products, you can taste either less smoky, more smoky, depending on how much you do in there. And so doing that on site gives us ultimate control, right? We can control how long we smoke the grains for, what grains we use, So
Now
those are
you got to
things we
do
do.
that when the grain's still wet, right?
Yeah, say that was
No.
exactly the question. It
So at
doesn't, you
first
get,
it-
you
it-
get
it-
absorption without moisture?
Yeah,
Wow.
at first we thought so. At first, we actually in the early times when we first tried it up, and we were just we had a little 4x4 smoke shed, and we were trialing it out. We thought we had to wet the grains, and actually that wasn't the case. Just using already malted barley that's been kilned and nice and dry, you do not need to actually have those grains be wet, and they still absorb all that flavor because it's just what happens. The ambient smell for 40 to 45 hours of pure smoke time is more than enough to smoke the grains.
Okay, that's a long time. I mean, you hear the opposite in Scotland. That's why I ask. You know, they're very
Yeah, of
adamant
course.
that
Yeah,
you know
yeah.
the peat flavor is only gonna get absorbed in the malt while it's still
But
wet.
they're not going to burn, well, right, and they're also not going to want to burn 45 hours worth of
Yeah.
peat either, which is probably part of it. I mean, they're burning 12.
Very expensive.
A
Very
long,
expensive.
long time would be 24 hours, right?
Yeah.
24,
Yeah.
maybe 36 would be a long burn peat time for them, and most of the time it's 12 or less.
And they're different, right? You know, we're talking about a moss, we're talking about a bog versus a
Yeah.
tree. And, you know, this is dry aged wood for you. We usually dry age wood for about 6 months. These are also California cherry trees too. So the
Right.
fact we
Peat
use
is
the cherry
super
wood-
oily. Yeah, peat is super
Totally.
oily versus that, which is going to be a lot. It's not oily.
And
Have you
people sometimes
experimented with any other woods?
Yeah. Not recently, but in the early days, we were messing around with a couple others. I did some oak smoke, and I did some pear. We did some apricot, and applewood. The problem is, like, applewood was just a little too smoky. The density of that smoke is just a little too great for me. Cherrywood made a hell of a lot of sense because if you think about cocktails, either at home or in bars,
Mhm.
you know, you're already putting maraschino or sweet vermouth or something in there that sort of has that cherryness to it. So, you know, it's like, why do that if you can just put it into the whiskey? So that's been working out fairly well for us. Want to jump on the rye whiskey too? Sonoma bourbon, again, first one I wanted you all to try. It's a good way to start our tasting. It also is a good palate cleanser too, because it's, you know, it's 92 proof and it's
awesome.
weeded bourbon. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Next, I would go with the Sonoma Rye. So this one, you know, as we talked before, this was my first love. This is my first headache, my first child. You know, rye whiskey, if you think about it, back in 2008, you know, Boardwalk Empire was all the rage, and people were into that whole prohibition era approach to things. And so I wanted to make a rye whiskey that tasted like rye. I want to taste like rye bread. I didn't want to mess with 100% raw because I like layers of flavor, you know, kind of going back to a little bit of my now cognac mind. You know, I really want to have sort of depth and layers of flavor. So this is 80% unmalted, 20% rye malt. So unmalted rye versus malted rye, right? And so that back end, when you try it, it should have a chocolatey finish, but it should be that sort of like rye bread up front. So think about like a good like pastrami on rye, or like a really like dense Russian rye bread. I really want that pumpernickel, anisey, caraway seed sort of beauty, you know, the herbaceousness. And then on the finish, I want that nice sort of like robust, chocolatey sort of backbone. So that's why it's good to use two different types of rye.
And are both of those coming from California still?
So the rye malt historically used to come from Warminster, actually, the malt house that's just sort of right near Stonehenge over in the UK. And I like that one because it had this beautiful sort of aliness to it, you know, an ale, like a brown ale. And now we're able to sort of mirror a very similar one here locally. And that was actually really tough for me to get away from that, because it's like, why mess with something that tastes good? You know what I mean? Like, if it's working,
Right.
But if we want to be 100% California grains, and it's part of our brand ethos, and it's good for the environment and it's good for the longevity of the brand, then, you know, it made a hell of a lot of sense to try and figure out how to malt rye here locally. Malting rye is not fun. I mean, there are a few people who malt in general, and then malting rye is just, you know, there's even less. So dialing that in has been a challenge,
Right.
and I'm stoked that we have sort of started to do that. But this is all still that California unmalted rye, and then that rye malt that came out of the UK. So that's what we're still working with today.
Right. It's interesting, and it isn't the overpower. It doesn't tick off all of the sort of stereotypical rye it isn't as for, you said it's herbaceous and it's got a little bit more of that grainy bready character and a little bit less of that forward like spearminty, right, that a lot of people think of, which would be more like like an MGP 51, an MGP 60 36 4 or something like that, whichever that.
Yeah, it depends on, obviously, if you're targeting like the Maryland style or the Pennsylvania style.
Right.
I mean, we were motivated by all those folks as you go to think about these things. I mean, there's a lot of great distillers in your area too who are making ryes. We're all just making them just sort of a little different. The farm guys out there who are growing a lot of their own rye. It depends what rye you're growing, right? Like this is largely said rye, but there's 100 different types of rye out there. And Todd Leopold will talk your ear off all day about different rye bases and rye, where rye is grown and where it's been traditionally done. But rye's a good cover crop. Most of the time, rye is really good at protecting your money grains. And so for a long time in California, it wasn't even being produced what it needs to be.
And because of I didn't say, well, the other people thinking, because the flavor is so intense, it provides you a lot more to work with in terms of band of what you can get out of it, because there are just so many more intense flavors to start with.
And I think as you go to look at, especially like the Benny shelf, right? Like take a gander at like all the rye whiskeys y'all got on there. This one does sort of stand on its own 2 feet. There's really not a lot of 100% ryes in general. And then all the 100%, largely they're 100% raw, which produces some of that spearminty sort of flavor to it, because they're using, the alpha amylase, like the enzymic conversion to convert starch into sugar.
Right.
That's just a different approach. Some of that is just like based on their ideology. They want to use 100% of what they grow. They don't have a malt house. They're not lucky enough to have that, or crazy, or whatever you want to think about us. So they use that, alpha amylase, and that does the job. But it makes things sort of one dimensional for me, and I like stuff that has a bit more nuance to it, I think.
And by the way, we have to mention this, but part of our chat from our listener watcher, Hangtown Fry, has pointed out that true pumpernickel etymology equals farting demon. So there you go.
Yeah, I'll put that on the label, I think, round farting demon. So those are our two non-smoked. I usually start with those. Those are good ways to begin. And if people are looking for a good utility rye, I think this is a good one. You can sort of grab it off the shelf and use it as you see fit.
Yeah, totally.
And then the bourbon is good too, because it fits whatever it is you need on that product. And barrel aging is generally the same on these, minimum about 2.5 years, and then it works its way all the way up into,
what's the bottling proof on the rye?
93. So just a little higher than the bourbon, 46.5% ABV.
Okay. And neither of them are chill filtered, I assume, or?
Yeah, we don't mess with any of that chill filtering stuff. And actually, it's funny, I didn't even bring it up, but like, I have a little replica of the one we use, but we use traditional style stills. Now, not this small, of course. This is my little travel buddy here, but this is an alembic, which is usually used for cognac and Calvados.
Yeah.
And there are a handful of distillers around the country who use these to make whiskeys. And so I'm hoping that one of the things you're tasting is also like depth, like thickness, viscosity. And that's just indicative of the still. That's what those things produce.
And those are direct fired?
They used to be. For the first 10 years, we were direct fired. In our new facility, which we incorporated a 3,000 gallon still I bought from the Forsyths folks. We moved away from the direct fire just because at that level, first of all, it's very difficult to direct fire such a large vessel. It also, one of the things I was noting was that the Maillard reaction, that burn that occurs on a very, very small scale inside the still, gets exemplified as it gets older. So I'm constantly sort of tasting through some of my like 6, 7, 8-year-old stock and being like, I don't know that I want to keep on perpetuating this, because ultimately that burnt note, as you stretch it out through time, can actually become a little bit more to the front.
Now, did you ever have to like put a rummager in like they would use in Scotland? Like the chain that drags around inside to keep it from going?
We had a motor that was sort of perched on the side. And if you want to see what that looks like, go over to the folks at Copper C. They do something similar. We're all sort of crazy people like that. But
And you were
yeah.
putting whole grain, so you weren't just distilling wort, you were distilling whole grain.
So we did a couple of times. Realistically speaking, we actually used to separate at that time prior to distillation just because of the burn. And there was actually a fire that was underneath it versus sort of like the Glenfarclas style where they use, the flue to heat the thing up. We were actually using direct fire to do that. So now we distill in the grain, which is why the 3,000 gallon still is built the way it is. It has an external heating system, so it literally sucks out.
Oh, an external
the mixture from
calandria then, and it just and it loops it back in.
Goes back in,
Interesting.
going around and around and around, which is really
That's
great.
that's another beer focused technology. That's interesting.
Yeah. And Forsyth's was the one who was like, you guys should do this. If you want to distill on the grain, here's the best way to do it. And we've had some great success with it. And I've been the flavor of the whiskey that's coming out of that big still. Initially, it was supposed to be a stripping still only. And then as I started to taste the spirit as it came off there, because I tried doing it in the early, when we first installed it, I was very impressed. I mean, the Forsyth folks built it as a larger version of my Alembics. So it has sort of it's sort of more squat. It's not super tall. And it doesn't have a huge run rate between the head and the condenser. So it really does do a really good job of producing this like viscous, oily whiskey, which is just what we are going for.
Wow. Brad, we got to see this still sometime. We've seen a lot of stills. I don't know that I've seen an Alembic on that scale. That's especially, it's not direct fired anymore, but
it's not what you think of coming from. It's not what you think of coming from Forsyth either.
No,
that's not typical of what Forsyth normally does.
Well, and again, it's truly theirs in the sense that it still has some of the cathedral style heads on it, but it's just the body is more like a Glenfarclas body, so it doesn't have a ton of height on it. But it has the boil ball is very similar to my Alembic head. So it has some similarities between them. And when we sat down with them and they build everything from scratch. So you say, here's what I'm trying to do, make me something that looks similar and functions similar. And they knocked it out of the park.
Cool.
So I'm pretty stoked about that. Yeah. I was in the queue behind McAllen, so it took a little while for me to get it. I was
like the 24 stills that they
were 24, 36, whatever the number was.
Right,
it was my one little still by comparison to their whatever they got. Took many years, but we commissioned it 5 years ago. We got it a couple years ago. So
did you happen to visit Glenfiddich when you were over there? Their wash stills are direct fire still, and those are monstrous stills. They're really cool to see.
Wow. Yeah, people are crazy. I mean, again, if you've been doing it for a while and you have the proper technology, to your point about throwing something in there and moving it around, you can do all right with it. Some of it just has to do with flavor too. Like, if that creates the flavor that you're going for, you should do that. The first distillation is one of the most important from a flavor perspective, especially as you're distilling on the grain. Which is why, again, really where like the Dan Farbers, right? Like he was the one who talked me off the ledge years ago. I was debating about getting a continuous column still, and I still might. I'm not poo-pooing any continuous column stills. They produce great whiskeys. You could use to drink as many or more than I have. They make some great whiskeys, but like the flavor creation that you get from a traditional pot still, as in the first distillation, is huge. All the esterification and the oils and viscosity and all that stuff that's being done on the top of that still is hard to mirror when you're doing it from an uber efficient way of just processing. So it's just different strokes, different folks.
Well, I interrupted you with the smoke thing. We were going to talk about the smoked ones, and I had asked about all the different experiments.
Yeah, so we've got two in market, two that are obviously we can try right now. Cherrywood Rye would be the next one for us to try. Realistically speaking, maraschino, as I said, is used in a lot of cocktails, so I figure why not put it in the grains.
Yeah.
And what you put into a mash bill has a great impact, obviously, on the whiskey. People like Corsair were doing some crazy stuff with smoke for a long time.
I was going to ask you that. The last time Brett and I were at Corsair, I think we tried 60 something different smoked whiskeys that day, and it was just like, name a kind of fruit that grows on a tree. They had smoked a whiskey over it, and it was just absurd. It was, and at some point they definitely all taste the same. I mean, come on.
Well, it was Andrew, and it was mostly to get us to say, it's like, we did all this, and then you need to tell us what is really bad you know, what's good and what's really bad, and we'll do the ones that are good again, and then we'll only do the ones that are bad once. It's like
that's one
after
hell
the
of a
first
focus.
5, guess what? They're all like licking a fireplace.
Yeah. I mean, I think smoke is important. You got to balance it correctly, right? There's a lot of people
Oh,
who play
100%.
around, and so you can balance it by balancing different grains. You can adjust the percentage in the mash bill, how long you smoke the grain for. You know, all these things have an impact on this. So our smoking profile is generally the same between the Cherrywood Rye and the Cherrywood Smoked Bourbon, but I just use less smoke on the Cherrywood Rye because I want it to be more on the finish, whereas the Cherrywood Smoked is a bit more sort of pervasively all over the entire palate. So Cherrywood Rye was created because I opened a barrel of Sonoma Rye and it smelled like cherry soda, right? So think about a cherry soda. You've got, you know, sort of sarsaparilla spice. You got all that sort of beautiful sort of root beery sort of spice on it. You got some vanilla froth. You think of it like that beautiful sort of bubblies of cherry soda. And then it has that nice sort of pronounced maraschino cherryness. So 80% rye, 10% wheat, 10% Cherrywood smoked barley. So 80-10-10. That's what this mash bill is. And we do all that smoking work in house, so it allows us to have that California grain the California smoke come through. And it again, it sort of tastes a bit like a Manhattan. You know, a lot of people who sort of likes Manhattans, this sort of reminds them of drinking a Manhattan it's in whiskey form. Makes a really great Manhattan if you happen to want to do that. You know, if you want to make a traditional rye style Manhattan.
What are we selling
and
these
you
for
can-
right now?
These are all, I just had it up. We're actually running, we're $39.99 on the bourbon and rye and $49.99 on the Cherrywood smoked bourbon and rye. And we're running right now, and we're running for another week or so, the bourbon and the rye are $36.99 on mops.
Nice.
Very fair.
Yeah.
So we are, you know, the Cherrywoods are different. And then you guys have drank as much whiskey as I said or more, but like, you know, I don't know of another Cherrywood rye, a Cherrywood smoked rye or another smoked rye. I'm sure they exist. I hate when people say firsts, but I don't know. And I'm sure they're coming.
Yeah.
Well, the Corsair stuff is still out there, and I mean Corsair still smokes, but that's really probably
There's some
Is that a
few
bourbon?
uses
Is that
a bit of Cherrywood smoked malt in
I
their
think that's in their single malt.
blended American whiskey, I think, as well.
Yes.
Yep.
In the blended American, yeah. Not a lot. I mean, smoke, as people don't, a little bit of smoke goes a long way. It can be extremely difficult to control and not.
I mean, I'm telling you 10%,
Yeah.
right? If I went, I tried doing some batches with 2025. I mean, you get above 15% and you're just like, holy shit. Like, ugh.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not a subtle flavor, you know, it's not. And so if the whiskey isn't otherwise going to balance it out, it's just going to dominate and take over.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's our Cherrywood smoked bourbon, Cherrywood rye. I love it a lot. It's a unique product. Barrel aging on this one is the same as the rest. Minimum 2, largely over 2.5. It's this is one I think if someone is looking for something different, it's a good gifter. It's a great one to showcase.
Where are you getting your barrels from now?
ISC has provided us with a lot of our 53-gallon barrels. We are working a little bit more with a local cooper as well, called Nadali. They're trying to dial in some of their cooperage, and they've got access to some really nice, like 3-year-old stock of wood, which is sort of a problem for a lot of folks for a little bit. So ISC, Nadali, and then we do make some 30-gallon barrels still, the quarter cask size. Because we have a large single barrel program we're started developing, and people are buying single barrels like crazy. We're presenting them in 30-gallon size. It's a nice, easy, digestive. You know, it's not like a huge amount of cases. It's usually 20 or 25 cases. So we've been selling people those quarter cask size, and then sometimes I'll use them in blends as well. But yeah, we're putting up largely 53s. That's my life.
Are there, for your California, are you sourcing any California oak or any West Coast oak? Or is it all Alba? Are you doing any Gariana or anything like that?
None of that yet. There are folks out in obviously Westland, and those guys are having a lot of fun with those things. We are largely the either Pennsylvania or Virginia. which is what the ISC folks are putting out there, or in Minnesota, with the cooperage up in Barrel Mill. And so that's we're all East Coast, we're all cold weather. There's really not a ton of oak from out here to mess with, and if I find some, I'm happy to play around with it.
Yeah, and see. But you're right, you've got like a year and a half or 2 years just with the wood on the ground before you even get around to making a barrel out of it.
I mean that's also what I try and tell people too. Single barrel picking is actually a lot of fun for me because as a blender, right, my job is to go back to the barrel room and make all of these barrels sort of taste like one thing that I've already made once before. And so I always the analogy I use is sort of like trying to get kindergartners to line up. All the barrels taste different. They were all put up the same day. And a lot of times those barrels are a combination of 5-year-old trees or 50-year-old trees. And so, they don't make barrels by one tree. There are all these staves that get put together and stuff. So it is difficult to do that as a blender. That's part of the challenge. So that's why the single barrel programs are fun, because I can sort of pick one that's unique and stands on its own 2 feet. And then some that are a bit more tapestry whiskeys, I just sort of throw them into the blend and make something that tastes good and reflective of what we've already made before.
That's cool. We have a really good question here from Hangtown Fry. He said, sorry if I missed this, but do you ever measure the smoke phenols like they would do with peat in Scotland with the malt?
It's a good question. We actually haven't, and I should, because we have a consistent smoking process. So the consistency on how much time and flavor, we're tasting things. We use largely sensory as our evaluators of, and we use not in the mash cooking side. Those are largely, we're doing, gravity levels and all sorts of stuff to determine that we've hit the same mark, and Anton pars to make sure we've gotten everything else we need in there. But sensory wise on smoking is largely how we've done it. So does this taste like the malt we've done before? Have we done our smoke time based on the 40 hours or 45 hours we call for? We should. I'd love to get it tested out. If I do, I will let you all know.
Yeah, I wonder what kind of equipment is even involved in that.
It's something
I think it's got to be like a mass spec or something like that. I think it's the big ones that they're running through now.
You burn it, and you figure out how much you got in there. That's kind of usually how they do things. How much alcohol it is, burn it, distill it.
I'm really enjoying this Cherrywood bourbon, by the way.
Yeah, good. Thank you. I'm stoked when people find one of our products that they sort of like and they sort of tell their friends about it. We've built our business. We are small. We're family owned. I don't have a gigantic corporation that moves the meter here. So, as people find things that they like of ours, whether it be the Sonoma Rye or Cherrywood Rye or Sonoma Bourbon or Cherry Smoke Bourbon, we hope that they tell their friends. And, we have Instagram, we're at Sonoma Whiskey. If anybody wants to join us on there, please do. It's my little plug for our Instagram and Facebook, but definitely would love to have everybody sort of follow our journey because it's going to be a fun one.
That's cool. What's the difference in mash bill with the smoked ones, if any?
So the Cherrywood Rye, obviously minimum 51% just be a rye whiskey. This is 80% rye, 10% wheat, 10% Cherrywood smoked barley. And then the bourbon is 67% corn, 20% rye, 13% Cherrywood smoked barley. So I tried making the Cherrywood smoked bourbon with some wheat because I wanted to differentiate it. And when you put wheat in there, we talked about this a little bit before, wheat doesn't really bring a lot to the table. So what ended up happening is that it sort of tasted sort of too doughy and flabby and didn't really have a lot of structure to it. Rye, especially rye malt, is a really good structural agent, and it's sort of the stage that lets other things sort of do its job, but it needs everything needs structure. So the rye that's in this is unmalted rye, but it's 67% corn, 20% raw rye, 13% Cherrywood smoked barley. That just sort of tied everything together and sort of gives it a little bit of spice, right? You get some spice from the rye, but you get that really sort of pronounced like balance that I'm really trying to seek. Like, all I'm doing is just trying to balance because I feel like sometimes whiskeys that I drink, other people's stuff has just sort of like, my grandpa used to make this, so I make it the exact same way. Or, I wanted to make something that tasted super smoky, so I threw so much, smoke phenol in there. What do you think? It's just like,
yeah,
balance your smoke, balance your flavor.
Right.
balance your oak tannins, like balance. Like I can hear
Yeah,
like
and
Pooh Bear.
people do.
Pooh Bear is just yelling behind me. Balance.
Yeah, well, and you don't. And if you want to have the character, look, Scotch blenders face this issue all the time when they're constructing blends, because there is some peated component in virtually every single big blend, but you don't pick up a Dewar's or a Johnny Walker Black Label or, you know, or a J&B and taste a whole bunch of peat. You get some spice and you get that character. And having played around a little bit in a blending lab in Scotland with components, it's tough. Because the edge that you're on, boy, you're there. And then when you go over the edge, you're over the edge in terms of too much.
Yeah, and that's why it's always good to do like little blends and sort of figure it out. Some of the people that I respect, you mean, look at like John Glazer over at Compass Box, just the way they sort of present different things. And you know, I've given John enough back pats in terms of how influential his products have been on my palate and my ability to look at another peer. But like people like that and how they balance smoke and balance flavor, it's really cool.
Yeah, they make some great whiskeys.
Yeah, and then they're all different and they all sort of stand. And sometimes they're still using largely, 60% of the same base, but then they get all this other cool shit in there. It's very fun.
All right, cool. Well, these were great, man. We're looking forward to trying that single malt someday. We got to see that alembic next time we're out in California.
If you need any quality
whiskey on that scale on an alembic, that's crazy.
If you need any quality control on the malt, you can just send some to Chicago. We'll give you the.
I would appreciate that. No, listen, you all would be. It sounds like you'd be as brutally honest as I need. I don't like yes people. I like people to tell me to go F myself. So yeah, let's talk. I'd love to have you try it. And then we do these other things that will come out. I'm next year. I'm going to start doing a bit more of my barrel finishing series. Mm-hmm. That's the one that I've been unable to really release a lot of just because it's a labeling problem. But we've got wine barrels and port barrels and all sorts of fun stuff to finish whiskey in. So you'll see more of that stuff out of us soon.
Cool.
Excellent.
Well, Adam, I appreciate it, man. Again, thank you. Thank you, everybody who tuned in tonight and checked it out. Brett, are we back on Monday or not? I'm not sure.
We're waiting to hear back from another California alcohol producer on a bit larger scale.
We're trying to get our. We want to talk to American brandy. Yeah.
So we've been actually doing with Dan. So we've been doing it's like Pat and Dan and I, and then another friend of ours who works for Winebow, Monique Houston, have been doing an ongoing series. We're 5 episodes in.
Yeah,
where we've covered, and Michael Veach was on, so we've covered some history.
Oh, cool.
We've covered fruit brandy last week. We've talked to Dan about traditional style. We talked to the Laird folks about just what they've been doing for 250 or 300 years. And so now our next step is to talk to somebody. Preferably, we're hoping to be able to talk to Dave Warder from McCall's, from Gallo, about some of the things they're doing, brandy, artisanal brandy, but on a massive scale.
Massive scale. I've heard about that place. That distillery is apparently freaking huge.
Yeah, you can
see pictures.
Their pot stills are like condos.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, and in the Bay Area, they're very expensive condos. So yes.
Yeah.
Well, so we'll see. I mean, listeners, stay tuned. As soon as we figure it out, we'll get it up on the website, but it might be delayed a week. But anyway, so there's your plug for the next week. So Adam, thank you again for joining us, man. These are great, and these are great whiskeys, and I love the Cherrywood smoke stuff. It's just so good, and it's rounded and it's delicious. So thank you again.
Appreciate the support.
Cheers to everybody who's seen us, and we'll talk to you next time, man. Appreciate it.
See you soon.
Cheers. Have a good one, y'all. Cheers. Thank you.
All right, cheers.
Have a good one, everyone. Bye.